The sea was calm, the sun bright, until chaos erupted. A massive Chinese warship slammed into a smaller U.S. Coast Guard cutter. The impact was violent, like an earthquake at sea. The American ship shuddered, alarms blaring, crew thrown from their feet as smoke and saltwater filled the air. The Chinese destroyer carved a deep gash into the cutter's hull. Water poured in, the fight for survival began. On the Chinese ship, the crew felt the jolt, but their damage was minor. The perfect morning was shattered. Was it a mistake, or something deliberate? Two crews, two nations, now bound by disaster in the open ocean. The stage was set for an international crisis. The South China Sea had just become the world's most dangerous flashpoint. This disaster happened in the South China Sea, one of the world's most contested waters. China claims almost all of it, but Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and others disagree. The U.S. doesn't pick sides on ownership, but insists on freedom of navigation. The Monroe, a modern Coast Guard cutter, was on patrol. The Lanzhou, a Chinese destroyer, was shadowing it. The Spratly Islands nearby are claimed by several nations. China has built military bases there. The U.S. and its allies see these bases as a threat to stability. The Monroe's presence was meant to enforce international law without escalating tensions. But for China, any U.S. ship in these waters is a challenge. The collision proved that even a law enforcement vessel could not avoid danger. The stage was set for confrontation long before the ships collided. Chinese ships often shadow U.S. vessels, leading to tense encounters. This time, the shadowing turned into disaster. The world's attention was now fixed on the South China Sea. The incident would test the resolve of both nations. The crisis had only just begun. On the Monroe's bridge, Captain Eva Rostova was thrown against a chart table as chaos erupted. Alarms blared, crew members shouted, and the ship listed dangerously. "Mayday, Mayday, this is U.S. Coast Guard Cutter Monroe. We have been struck by a foreign naval vessel, taking on water." Captain Rostova, injured but focused, barked orders. "Damage control teams, report! Get me a flooding report now!" Below deck, Seaman Leo Diaz saw two shipmates thrown overboard. "Man overboard!" Training took over. Life rings deployed, rescue boat readied even as the ship flooded. On the Chinese destroyer Lanzhou, Captain Wei Lin stood rigid, issuing cold, precise orders. "Document everything, film the American vessel, maintain distance." The Chinese crew was calm, focused on control and narrative. The Americans fought for survival. The Chinese prepared for the political fallout. The contrast was stark, one crew desperate, the other calculating. On the Monroe, sailors battled rising water, set up triage for the injured, and worked side by side to save their ship. On the Lanzhou, the crew watched, recording every moment for Beijing. The collision was more than an accident. It was a test of leadership, training, and resolve. The Monroe's crew faced a life-or-death struggle. The Lanzhou's crew prepared for the diplomatic storm ahead. Two ships, two missions, one crisis. The world was about to witness the fallout. The Monroe's survival depended on every second. The Chinese destroyer's next move could change everything. In these moments, the fate of nations hung in the balance. The South China Sea was now a stage for global drama. The crisis was only beginning. The minutes after the collision were critical. On the Monroe, damage control teams fought rising water, plugging the hull with wedges and patches. The communications officer sent a distress signal, reporting their location and damage. The Chinese warship stayed nearby, offering no help, only accusations over the radio. The Monroe launched a small boat, rescuing the two crew members thrown overboard. The nearest U.S. destroyer, USS John Finn, raced to the scene. A Navy surveillance plane flew overhead, relaying updates to commanders. The Chinese destroyer accused the Monroe of reckless maneuvering, blaming the Americans for the crash. The Americans documented everything, preparing for the inevitable investigation. As hours passed, the Monroe's crew contained the flooding, but the ship was crippled and adrift. The injured were cared for, the crew exhausted but resolute. The arrival of the USS John Finn brought relief. The first phase of the crisis was over. The fight for survival had ended, but the political storm was just beginning. The world was watching, waiting for the next move. The South China Sea had become a global flashpoint. The Monroe's crew had saved their ship, but the real battle was now diplomatic. The Chinese destroyer's accusations set the stage for a war of words. The crisis was far from over. The next phase would play out on the world stage. News of the collision spread instantly. The Pentagon confirmed the incident, calling China's actions unprofessional and unsafe. The White House demanded answers. Beijing accused the US of illegal intrusion. Both sides released conflicting evidence. Radar data, video footage, each blaming the other. America's allies expressed support, urging calm and respect for international law. European nations called for diplomacy, fearing global instability. The United Nations offered to mediate, but the US and China were far apart. The incident became a global he said, she said. The truth was lost in a fog of accusations. The collision was no longer just about two ships. It was about power, credibility, and control. The stakes were enormous: regional stability, global trade, and the balance of power. The world watched, hoping the crisis wouldn't spiral out of control. The South China Sea was now the center of global attention. The fallout would shape international relations for years to come. The next moves by Washington and Beijing would be critical. This collision wasn't the first close call between rival navies. In 2001, a US surveillance plane collided with a Chinese fighter near Hainan Island, sparking a major crisis. In 1988, a Soviet frigate bumped a US cruiser in the Black Sea, sending a dangerous message. These incidents show how easily routine operations can escalate. The South China Sea has seen many near misses, like in 2018, when the Lanzhou nearly collided with the USS Decatur. Each encounter raises the risk of disaster. What made this collision different? It was a direct hit, not a near miss. A Coast Guard cutter, not a Navy destroyer, was involved, changing the dynamic. The US likely chose the Coast Guard to send a less aggressive message. But China's willingness to collide with even a law enforcement vessel signals new aggression. Beijing is no longer interested in subtle signaling. The stakes are higher than ever. Each incident increases the risk of war. The world must take these warnings seriously. The South China Sea is now a proving ground for global power. The next mistake could be catastrophic. The lessons of history have never been more urgent. The collision sent shockwaves through US-China relations. It was more than an accident. It was a sign of a new Cold War. Trust was shattered, and military communications strained. Southeast Asian nations now face impossible choices between security and economics. Allies like Australia and Japan will likely draw closer to the US, fearing China's assertiveness. The global economy is at risk. Trillions in trade pass through these waters. Insurance costs could rise, supply chains could be disrupted, and prices could climb worldwide. The world is dividing into rival camps. For the US, this is a test of resolve. For China, a test of ambition. The answers will define the future world order. The collision was about more than ships. It was about competing visions for the planet. The South China Sea is now the front line of global rivalry. The stakes could not be higher. The first priority is de-escalation. Washington and Beijing must step back from the brink. Hotlines must be used, diplomats must work behind the scenes, and the Monroe's crew must be recognized for their bravery. An investigation will be contentious. Each side will stick to its story. This incident is a wake-up call for clear rules of engagement at sea. The US and China must agree on protocols to prevent future accidents. Without them, another deadlier collision is only a matter of time. The world must learn from this disaster. Territorial disputes must not be allowed to fester. International law and freedom of navigation must be defended. The safety of sailors and the stability of the world depend on professionalism and restraint. The collision is a lesson in the fragility of peace. The future of global security may depend on learning from this day at sea. The world cannot afford to ignore the warning.